We just kind of hear the rounds pinging around us, bouncing off our vehicles. But then eventually I see this car at the end of this alleyway, and I can see the muzzle flashes coming from the windows. And so I tell everyone else, hey, light up that car. And so we all just start unloading.
Curtis Hice was one of the thousands of regular enlistees in 2001, people who were joining the military in pursuit of personal excellence, social improvement, or maybe even adventure. Although combat deployments always are on the table, he joined at a time when answering that call didn't seem as if it were going to happen. When it did, he learned quickly enough that loss is a part of war, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to accept.
I remember hearing someone yell, and I opened my eyes and looked up, and it was Corporal Montalvo's yelling, and I couldn't tell what he was yelling. I could just kind of see his lips moving and hear him yelling something because it's so loud in there. But then eventually I made it out to say, Sergeant Rios is hit.
What is true bravery? What makes a hero a hero? Tested by the worries of what's happening at home, thousands of miles away, and the reality of what you're facing here and now. When your life is in danger every second, and it's either kill or be killed. From Wondery and Incongruity Media, this is Anthony Russo, and this is War. There never was a question about whether Curtis Hice would join the U.S. military. From the time he was a little kid, it was mostly what he focused on, even joining the Civil Air Patrol as soon as he was old enough. It gave his mother the impression that he would end up in the Air Force, but, as he puts it, the Marine recruiter got to him first. Although she had some reservations, Hice's mother signed him up for the early entry program.
I signed up during the summer of 2001. It would have been between my junior and senior year of high school. A lot of my friends in school already knew that I'd signed up for the military. I remember specifically being in homeroom that morning. So when that happened, of course, we all turned our TVs on and we were watching it there in the classroom. They all kind of turned around and looked at me as if to say, well, guess you know where you're going.
Both at the time and in retrospect, he really didn't. When you're a 17-year-old, the future doesn't stretch much past the next few weeks. Hice didn't watch the news or consider the geopolitical implications of his enlistment. He just focused on becoming a Marine. In his mind, the U.S. military was more about adventure and discipline than combat. The only further implications had to do with his girlfriend, for whom his very enlistment was a problem. The possibility of war after that weighed much more heavily on her.
I don't really know. Maybe I was a little too young and too naive to really put all the dots together and realize that I specifically would be deploying somewhere. And I remember more specifically my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, she was really upset about it. She really didn't want me joining at all. Of course, I did anyway, and we almost broke up over it. And I was trying to convince her that it would be okay by saying, oh, it'll just be an easy 4 years. I'll do my 4 years and probably stay stateside, and then I'll get out and it'll be done. And then, of course, when September 11th happened, she knew at that point, no. You're probably going to be going somewhere, Afghanistan or something. To look back on it, in retrospect, I was 18 years old, and I just was really more focused on my training at that time.
The last part of 2001 and the first part of 2002 saw a diverse and disparate crop of recruits. Sure, there was an enlistment bump in response to the September 11th attacks, but it's important to remember that there were probably many people in the same position as Hice. Young folks who had been committed to enlisting since they were children, some with plans to make the military their career, and many like Hice who were open to careers in the military but more focused on getting training and money for college. As late as 2002, long after graduation, and with the Iraq War looming, his attitude about that really hadn't changed at all.
My MOS was 1371, which is combat engineer. I come from a family that works in construction. Most of the guys on my dad's side of the family work in construction, specifically brick masonry. And so if I hadn't joined the Marines, that's probably what I'd be doing today. And so I guess I kind of figured that if I'm going to be a Marine, I'm going to maybe try to do something that I already know anyway. And I liked construction. I liked building things. And the recruiter was showing me all these pictures in his book about Marines building this and building that. And I thought, oh, that sounds like it's right up my alley. And I remember when I think I started to get a glimpse of what might be happening is because while I was there at Camp Lejeune doing my combat engineer training, Initially, my orders were to be at 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion, which is on Camp Lejeune. So I would have stayed there on the East Coast. And I was really excited about that because I knew that it would have been a short 10-hour drive home and I could come home almost any weekend I wanted to. But by the end of our class, just a few days before graduation, my orders, along with the orders of a lot of other Marines in my class, got changed to 1st Combat Engineer Battalion on the West Coast at Camp Pendleton, California.
As 2002 turned into 2003, the reality of the war still hadn't clicked with Hice. He found himself in Camp Margarita, a section of Pendleton where he and scores of other Marines were waiting for their unit assignments. As a new Marine, it didn't strike him as very peculiar at the time, but in retrospect, there were an awful lot of unattached Marines there for longer than there should have been. He and his fiancée Julie were still trying to figure out how they were going to work their long-distance relationship when the reality of the holding area finally was made plain.
I remember this chief warrant officer coming out, and we're in formation, standing at attention, and he says, Marines, the reason we haven't sent you all to your respective units is because your units are either already in Kuwait or they're en route to Kuwait, and you're going to meet them there. My fiancée at the time, she's expecting me to already be working on getting home so that we can get married. And so I had to call her and say, well, look, that's not going to happen. There were no 7-month rotations like there are now. I think our order said however long it takes to defeat Saddam's regime. So I said, you can either wait till I get home and then I'll come home and we can get married, or you can fly out here. And if we can find a courthouse, and work it out, we can go get married here in California, which ultimately is what we did.
These are the kinds of details that are often lost in the big picture run-up to the war in Iraq. The personal logistics of unexpected deployment, the chaos of what would normally be a pretty mundane process. Julie had to change her flight just so she could get to California early enough for a Saturday courthouse wedding. Her parents came in that afternoon, and the new family spent the last few weeks of February together before heading back east. All the while, small groups of guys were flying out commercial to Kuwait and joining their units. Hice's turn came in March 2003, where he found out he'd be riding shotgun in the second wave of the invasion, whenever that occurred. Every day there were rumors that the invasion was going to be the next day. One day, it turned out that the rumors were true.
I remember in the middle of the night being woken up and, being told, okay, it's about to kick off. This is the real deal this time. And I remember in the dark staging all of our vehicles so that when the convoy did take off, it would be kind of in an orderly fashion. So I knew it was really happening. And we left our base in Kuwait and went to a staging area just immediately south of the border. And remember hearing the artillery shooting at them. And I remember then realizing, okay, this is real. This is really happening. I remember driving into Iraq and it being dark. So it must have been in the middle of the night, seeing lots of fires, some of the oil wells that had been burned, and they were burning. And so that was kind of an eerie sight. And then, the burnt out holes of tanks and Iraqi military trucks and things like that, and some dead bodies on the sides of the roads. The fact that they didn't shake me is what shook me most, if that makes any sense. I guess because you expect to be affected by things in a certain way. And then when you're not affected by them, it really kind of makes you question yourself. Like, is there something wrong with you because you weren't affected? So that bothered me a little bit.
The thing is, when you're seeing your first war up close, you realize that there is no expectation that will match up with your experience. It's a long way from the lush greenery of central Tennessee to the deserts of Iraq. Plus, there's a surrealty to it. Hice had spent the better part of his youth playing at being in the military, but even with all his preparation and training, he couldn't possibly have known what it would be like.
I remember meeting up with my fire team leader. His name was Lance Corporal Kun. He was from Cambodia. He was really tall and lanky. And I was going to be in the M240 machine gun fire team in our squad. I didn't know much about the 240. I had gone through a little bit of training with it in Marine combat training, so I was a little familiar with it, but I certainly wasn't an expert on it. But that's the fire team I was going to be joining up with, and so I was going to learn about it whether I liked it or not. We never knew when we stopped if we were only going to be stopping for a few minutes or a few hours or a few days. We didn't stop very much, but we'd stopped for the night, and we got out and we dug our fighting holes. We always got out and we usually dug a hole to kind of sleep in a little fighting position, again, because you never knew how long it was going to be. We often didn't dig them very deep because the ground was very hard, and also, again, because we didn't know how long we were going to stay there. We stayed the night there, and the next morning we got up pretty early, and we had gone so far ahead of our resupply convoy that we didn't have a lot of chow. We were down to like 1 MRE a day. We were trying to ration our water because the supply chain was so far back behind us. I remember our squad leader coming to us that morning. His name was Sergeant Dwayne Rios, and he was kind of giving us some intel. The intel was that there was an Iraqi mechanized unit in this town, and that we were expecting some pretty tough resistance going in there.
The Marines mounted up their light armored amphibious assault vehicles, also called Amtracs or AAVs. If the Iraqis did have a mechanized unit waiting for them, though, the Amtracs wouldn't provide much protection. Hice and the rest of the engineers had been training with their mop suits in case of a chemical attack. It was April 4th, 2003, and in addition to the threat of gas attacks, there was the prevailing belief that Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard would fight to the last man. As the Marines pressed on toward the capital city, that at least sounded true. Elsewhere in the battle, U.S. forces successfully had taken Baghdad International Airport, but U.S. ground forces headed for the capital were meeting more than a little resistance. Hice already had learned what before and after combat looked like. Before too long, he would know the worst of what during did as well.
But so we were going through this city, we were buttoned up. You can hear all the combat going on around you. You can hear the machine guns on your own vehicle shooting and all the other vehicles engaging the enemy. You can hear all the explosions. There's a small window, I remember, on the back of the AAV. You could flip it open. I say window, it's basically like 3-inch glass with a metal plate that covers it up on the inside. And you can open up that metal plate and look through this vision block. And I remember seeing the plumes of smoke and the burned out holes of disabled vehicles on the side of the road and stuff like that. So you knew that we were in the thick of it. But there's not much you could do about it. And one of the things you learn as a Marine is, anytime you can take an opportunity to sleep or eat, you go ahead and do it, because you never know when you're going to get to do it again. And so I tried to close my eyes and get a little bit of sleep. And I remember from where I'm sitting in the vehicle, looking up toward the front of the vehicle, Sergeant Rios was in the TC hatch area. And he's got his own little personal hatch that opens up. And he can stand up out of that hatch and engage the enemy with his weapon. And he was doing that. He was really kind of covering the left-hand side of the vehicle, since the turret was only really covering the right-hand side. It's really loud inside the vehicle, and it was really dark. There was a little bit of ambient light from a small little light we had inside the vehicle. But I remember hearing someone yell, and I opened my eyes and looked up, and it was Corporal Montalvo. He was kind of the next in line in charge below our squad leader, Sergeant Rios. But Corporal Montalvo was yelling, and I couldn't tell what he was yelling. I could just kind of see his lips moving and hear him yelling something because it's so loud in there. But then eventually I made it out to say, Sergeant Rios is hit.
Catching a quick nap in the middle of combat is a little easier when the war is outside, but all of a sudden, the battle made its way inside the Amtrak. This wasn't just a noise, a close call waiting to happen, or maybe something you could move to the back of your mind. This was the war coming to call, entering the relative safety of your light armored vehicle and snapping you foggily awake to the chaos and carnage all at once. For Hice, the reality of combat and the war in the Middle East were about to get a lot more personal. I want to talk to you about Care Of. Care Of is a monthly subscription vitamin service that delivers completely personalized vitamin and supplement packs right to your door. It works like this. Go to takecareof.com and take the online quiz. They'll ask about your diet, health goals, and lifestyle choices. It only takes about 5 minutes to find out your personal, scientifically backed vitamin and supplement recommendations. As it turns out, 90% of people fall short of FDA-recommended guidelines for at least one vitamin or nutrient. This quiz can help you find out if you're lacking. I was. When I took mine, they recommended a regimen aimed at helping improve my sleep habits. And it's the habit part of this that's really intriguing. I'm getting older and making more of an effort to take my overall health a little bit more seriously, which includes thinking more about what I eat and developing better habits. Care Of has become a significant part of that. Once they suggest supplements, they'll send you a 30-day supply in individual serving packets. Each day I have one with my name on it and an inspirational quote, a piece of trivia, or a daily challenge. For instance, yesterday there was a quote from Nathaniel Hawthorne reminding me that happiness comes incidentally only. And today I learned that some experts believe that the human eye can distinguish up to 10 million colors. But for me, what it really is a second of mindfulness, taking a moment to think about something I otherwise might not have while trying to improve my health. Plus, you can keep track of all your health goals with the Care Of app, which also helps remind you to take your supplement. If you've been thinking about starting a new health plan or changing up your routine, now is a great time to take advantage of this special offer. For 50% off your first month of Care of vitamins, go to takecareof.com and enter This Is War 50. That's takecareof.com and enter This Is War 50. Good habits can be hard to build. Care of can help keep you mindful of your health. Go to takecareof.com and enter This Is War 50. Hice snapped awake from his light doze and knew it was time to act. Minutes before, he was being driven to his part of the war where he and the other engineers would do their own mission, but now that mission had changed. They had to react to the fact that Sergeant Rios was wounded and deal with whatever came next as all the chaos of the invasion and the resistance exploded around them.
We pulled him back into our area of the vehicle. It's a more open area where the rest of us are all sitting. And again, we have very little light, but we're trying our best to find out where he's hit, and we're taking off all of his equipment and all of his gear, trying to find out where the wound is. And there's just so much blood. It's just a lot of blood, which made it hard to find out where the wound was. And so eventually we did find it right below his right ear, and we knew that it was a pretty devastating place to be shot. And the only thing you could really do was apply pressure to it. We're taught a lot about combat life-saving, and we're, tourniquets, but you can't put a tourniquet on a neck. They had radioed for our corpsman. Of course, he's in another vehicle, and so he's got to get out of his vehicle and run to our vehicle, probably a couple hundred yards at least, through the fire, and then get into our vehicle and then try to work on Sergeant Rios. And I remember I was at the back hatch of our vehicle where someone would come in or out, and I remember someone pounding on that back hatch, and I opened it up, and it was our doc, our corpsman, Clint Holloway. So Doc Holloway comes in, and he immediately starts working on Sergeant Rios. We tell him where the wound is, and he starts working on him, trying to kind of bring him back around because he was fading in and out of consciousness. So he starts working on him, and we're all just kind of watching. There's not really much that we can do. Apparently someone else on the radio was working on a plan for us to meet up with an ambulance Humvee so that we could move Sergeant Rios to that vehicle, kind of a casualty collection point. So we met up at this kind of a T-shaped intersection. And by this time, Doc Holloway had realized that he couldn't bring Sergeant Rios back. He just lost too much blood in that short period of time, and he was dead.
Corporal Montalvo took command, but there still was so much to do. Remember, the push into Baghdad is underway. There is no returning to base. In fact, there's really no base to which they might return. They'd been sleeping in holes in the desert the night before. Hice and the rest of the unit headed to rendezvous with the ambulance Humvee at the casualty collection point so they could send Sergeant Rios back home to his family and continue pushing forward.
We're at this T-shaped intersection. There's, 2 and 3 story buildings around us. We're in the middle of some town. I don't know the name of the town. Myself and the other security guys, we jump out of the vehicle, and we're kind of looking in all the windows, the rooftops for anybody who might be shooting at us. And it's eerily quiet right now. The guys that are carrying Sergeant Rios' body, they're kind of carrying him in a poncho liner, sort of a makeshift stretcher. And they go to put him in the back of the ambulance Humvee, and it's full of dead and wounded Marines. And they can't put him in there. So they got to put him back in our vehicle.
It didn't take too long to understand that the only solution was to have choppers come in to evacuate all the casualties. The best the Marines could do was continue pulling security while they waited for support. In the meanwhile, they were exposed during this lull in the fighting, but the quiet never lasts long, and the Marines knew it couldn't last much longer. When the shooting started then, they weren't completely surprised.
We did start taking fire from an alleyway there in that sort of T-shaped intersection that we were at. And so we're getting shot at, and at first we don't know exactly where it's coming from. Everybody's kind of looking around. We just kind of hear the rounds pinging around us, bouncing off our vehicles. Luckily, no one's hit. But then eventually I see this car at the end of this alleyway, and I can see the muzzle flashes coming from the windows. And so I tell everyone else, hey, light up that car. And so we all just start unloading on this car. And in a couple of minutes, the firing stopped, and that was it. There was other fighting going on around us in adjacent streets that wasn't directly affecting us, but it was, kind of added to the chaos. And I remember at one point, the AH-1 Cobras flying over and shooting some of their rockets to some of the houses around us. And that was pretty exciting. We were all kind of, shouting for them, because it was kind of felt like the cavalry had arrived. Right after that happened and the firing kind of died down, that's when the CH-46 came in and landed on the street right there. And we were loaded up Sergeant Rios' body onto the helicopter along with the other dead and wounded Marines that were in that Humvee. And then they took off, and we got back in our vehicle and drove to wherever the next spot was that we were supposed to stop.
They didn't drive for very long, but they drove fast. Hice talks about bouncing around in the back there in the dark, wondering what the next mission was going to be, trying not to focus too much on Rios. In retrospect, there might have been something of a hurry to catch up with the rest of the detachment, which had continued on, or maybe the speed was more related to the post-firefight adrenaline. Either way, when they reached their destination, the engineers weren't going to get any breaks.
We're all just kind of there, quiet, in our own thoughts until we finally stop. And when we finally stop, they open up the top hatches, and then our back hatch is also opened. And this is the first time that the light is being let inside the vehicle, and we can kind of see everything that's happened. We can see the blood everywhere, and Sergeant Rios's gear and his clothes that we'd cut off, laying there. And that's the first time, really all kind of sank in, what just happened. Standing there at our back hatch, I remember seeing our platoon sergeant, Gunny Fleming. And I remember him kind of looking in the door and making eye contact with each of us, and also kind of assessing the situation. And he knew what had happened. Obviously, he had heard all the traffic on the radio, but it was his first time seeing it all as well. And I remember him just saying, "Get out and dig your fighting holes." For a second, I remember being mad about that. Like, are you kidding me? I mean, do you know what just happened? And only thing you can say is get out and dig your fighting holes. But, later on, looking back on it, I kind of realized, he had a job to do, and his job was to protect us. And he was doing that for a reason. He knew that for us to sit in there and look at that and dwell on it was not good, that we needed to get out and get back to work, But at the time, after going through what we just went through, it just seemed like kind of a cold response. But I totally get it now in retrospect.
And it was more than just teaching them to put Rios's death in the background for the time being. It was a reminder that they were Marines in combat, and that there was no place for breastbeating when there was work to be done. And there was plenty of work for the engineers. They were attached to the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, as it headed toward Baghdad. With each objective the 1-5 ruled through, there were caches of weapons that needed destroying and walls that needed breaching in those early days of pacifying the city. But much like the initial invasion itself, winning Baghdad wasn't the difficulty the U.S. had worried it would be.
We got to one of Saddam's palaces right there on the river, and I remember they called for the engineers to get out and do their thing, which was to breach the gate to the palace. And I remember we got out and we were looking at it, and one of the officers from 1-5 was there with us, and he was asking us, okay, what can you guys do, and what kind of explosives are you going to use and all this stuff. And I remember our machine gunner, Mitchell was his name, and I remember him just pushing the gate, and it just opened. So very anticlimactic. When I say a palace, it's not just one building. It's really a walled compound with several buildings. And these are big, beautiful, elaborately built buildings. But they'd been bombed. Like one half might be standing and the other half was just rubble. You could tell that it was a nice place at one point, but it had been pretty well blown up. And you could also tell that it had been looted to a certain extent. A lot of the furniture had been taken out and air conditioners stolen and things like that. But then there were little pockets of resistance left in the palace too that were shooting at us. They had to be cleared out.
10 days after Sergeant Rios was shot, Baghdad fell and the Marines were setting up patrol bases and fortifying their positions. Hice and the rest of the engineers joined up with their company in Diwania and started building a semi-permanent presence there. April turned to May. The Saddam Hussein statue was toppled. President Bush made his mission accomplished speech aboard the Abraham Lincoln, and on May 10th, his 19th birthday, Hice was homeward bound on the USS Anchorage.
It was really, really nice. My wife was there. She had driven out with her brother and got us an apartment and met me there in California. It was just, it felt safe, I guess, for the first time in a while. We didn't deploy again until February of 2004. It seems normal now for Marines to have these back-to-back deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, but at that time it wasn't. I mean, we expected to go over there for the initial invasion in 2003, do our thing, defeat Saddam, and then leave, and for the Army or the coalition to handle it from that point on. We didn't expect to have to go back. Yeah, we found out we were going back for that second tour. I remember it was in December of 2003. We wound up leaving in February of 2004. Yeah, it was pretty upsetting whenever I had to tell her that I was going back for a second deployment. And by this time, the war had changed. Even on the ship ride home from our first tour, we could tell by watching the news that the war was shifting into something else, into an insurgency. And you were hearing already stuff on the news about an insurgency, although I didn't know what that meant exactly, but we could tell that it was something different. When we found out the area that we were going to was a town called Fallujah. I'd never heard of Fallujah. I didn't know where that was. I do remember on the way over there, we were flying and we stopped at a base in Germany, and we came across some soldiers, some Army guys who I think we're headed home from Iraq. And they asked us where we were going, and we said Fallujah. And I remember they both looked at each other and then looked back at us and said, man, you guys be careful over there. That place is crazy.
By early April 2004, Operation Vigilant Resolve, which would become known as the First Battle of Fallujah, would be underway and really set the tone for the rest of the war. In the years since the conflict began, as Hice had said, things had shifted and there was a different war being fought in the Middle East. A grayer war than anyone had expected, with different rules and approaches and tactics. Hice had been surprised during his first deployment at how difficult it was to tell the insurgents from the civilians. Arriving back in Iraq, he would find the difference was no clearer. In fact, if anything, it was more cloudy. Fallujah was bubbling over with Saddam loyalists and foreign fighters who had come in to support the insurgency against the American and coalition forces. Skirmishes increasingly were a problem, and the enemy was learning to make better use of IEDs, both to disrupt the Allied forces trying to take the city and to intimidate the nascent Iraqi army. On the ground, Hice and the rest of the engineers were tasked with clearing IEDs and helping prop up the Iraqi army.
You know, it was just kind of a fight waiting to happen. And you had some army there already, and then they had a few run-ins with locals. It just was kind of breeding up to be this really big fight, and it just so happened that it happened when we got there. We replaced a group from the 82nd Airborne. While we were doing our left seat, right seat with them is when the Blackwater guys were killed. They were just driving through the city and they were ambushed, and they killed them, and they burned their bodies and drug them through the streets and strung them up, hung them from a bridge there in Fallujah. So that's when we had our real eye-opener to what Fallujah was going to be like.
The Blackwater contractors were killed on March 31st, and the response from the U.S. was almost immediate. Ambushes are something to be expected during a war, but the audacity of the aftermath made a deliberate and significant response from the U.S. military absolutely necessary. It was just unacceptable for the insurgency to have that kind of unchecked control over the streets. Fallujah had to be pacified either by the Iraq security forces or by the United States. The U.S. planned and executed Operation Vigilant Resolve. The idea was to take control of the city and disperse or destroy insurgent forces within it. Retaking Fallujah was to be a joint effort that included a significant role for the Iraqi army.
Our job as engineers was kind of two-part. We were going to build a bunch of machine gun posts. We would load them on trucks, drive them to the edge of the city, and then the Iraqi military, they were going to man those. And then the engineers, we were going to splinter up into our squads and attach to our infantry companies and basically be attached to them throughout the rest of the operation. You know, the morning of the operation was going to kick off. We loaded them up and we drove them to the edge of the city. We went under this trestle. The road starts curving around to the left, and we started unloading the bunkers. It's dark. It's maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. And we start getting shot at from these houses across the road. And they're probably, 200 or 300 yards from us at this time. And I'm a machine gunner now. I'm assigned to the M240 machine gun, which is mounted on a kind of a tripod in the back of our vehicle with the bunkers and stuff. I've got to stay there on the gun to provide security. I was engaging the firing from the houses. So we're shooting at them. And I remember at one point we were told to stop. We were told to cease fire, which we didn't quite understand that order at the time. But it's because they had a AC-130 gunship overhead. And they were going to use the AC-130 to engage these houses. And so they did. So we ceased fire and the AC-130 opened up, which was awesome. It was like the 4th of July. And so he starts unloading on these houses. The shooting stops. I remember during the firefight, I can see the silhouette of a Marine. And I don't know exactly who it is because I can't really make out his face or anything because it's still dark. But I can see the silhouette of this Marine running to my left, and he's running toward the enemy, to get closer to them. He's running up to the edge of the road, kind of where the ditch is, where the road kind of rises up. And I remember wondering to myself, what's he doing? He's by himself. It's not like it's a whole bunch of Marines, it's just one. I heard him call for a corpsman, and the corpsmen go over there and they're working on this guy. And I see him carrying him off a few minutes later in a stretcher. And I found out later that morning that was Corporal Tyler Fay. He is a Marine from our platoon. And I found out later that he did die. He was shot through the neck, much like Sergeant Rios was in 2003. And to make it even more weird, it was a year to the day.
The siege of Fallujah threw the potential for humanitarian disaster into sharp relief. About a third of the town had been evacuated, but there were still an unacceptable number of civilians mixed in with the insurgents. By May, the siege would come to an end and the U.S. would be planning Operation Phantom Fury, which would kick off the Second Battle of Fallujah later that year. Hice and the rest of his platoon were withdrawn to a village outside the city and eventually back to their base and then home. Once there, Hice planned on getting married and closing out his days as a Marine stateside. But that wasn't going to happen.
After coming home, we went home on our 30-day block leave. But actually, 3 of the Marines that were in my platoon, of course, they were all on leave at the same time. One of them was Stephen Hice. The other one was Jared Brown, and then Justin Dornacher. And Jared Brown and Justin Dornacher were from West Virginia, and Stephen Hice was from Kentucky. So relatively speaking, they were close by to Tennessee. And so they came to the wedding. So that was cool. And they were all in the wedding. So they got to, see my family and meet them. And until then, it was all just talk. We'd all swapped stories about where we were from and our families. But now we're actually getting to experience it with each other. And that was pretty cool. We went back to California. And I remember Julie and I flew back together. And Jared Brown met me at the airport and met us at the airport and drove us back to, our apartment. He said, "Hey, our company is not slated to go back until like April or May of 2006. And he and I were both going to be getting out in like May and June of 2006. And so we took that to mean that we probably wouldn't deploy again because they wouldn't send us over there with only a month left in our enlistment, just to send us right back. So we thought, well, we're good. I mean, we can just skate out the rest of this time. But after being back stateside for a few months, they realized that Charlie Company was going to be going back to Iraq much sooner. And they had a bunch of Marines who were getting ready to get out and they wouldn't have enough time to deploy. So they moved a bunch of the Marines from Bravo Company, myself included, and Jared Brown, a lot of the other Marines in Bravo Company. They moved us over to Charlie Company because we had enough time to deploy one more time to go with Charlie Company. So I went back a third time with Charlie Company. I remember that being pretty devastating news for both of us, especially when we thought that there wouldn't be a third and then found out there was going to be.
If there was any upside at all to this third deployment, it was that Hice felt as if he were ready for it. He knew how things worked in Iraq. He had been in enough danger and in enough gunfights that he understood how he would react under the pressure of battle. If anything, it was the quiet that bothered him the most.
I don't know if you ever really get used to it. It seems like to me, I always wound up being a little bit better after the shooting started. To me, some of the scariest times was always when you're driving into what you think is going to be a firefight and then it doesn't happen. Or those few minutes right before the firefight starts, your heart is pounding and you just know that it could happen any minute, something could happen. And it's just, that's the most intense moment. But once it starts, your training kicks in and you just do exactly what you were trained to do. It's almost like you're on autopilot. For me, that's when I tended to calm down. But it was those few minutes, it was that anticipation leading up to it that was the worst. But the part of Iraq that we were going to was also much different. We were going to Al-Qaim, Iraq, which is on the Syrian borders, extreme western Iraq, and it was known for IEDs. And my first 2 deployments hadn't really had a lot of IEDs, so this was something totally new. This time, instead of relieving an Army unit, we were relieving another Marine unit. It was a reserve unit with them. But I remember when we got there, seeing the motor pool full of just blown up Humvees and trucks.
The engineers spent much of their time on mine clearing detail, hunting and digging out IEDs just so convoys could make it in and out of their area of operation, or AO. And when they were heading out for patrols, the Marines found it just made more sense to cut a new road through the desert than to try and deal with the IED-heavy main roads in that area. But their day-to-day mission required they walk along with a metal detector in front of the convoys, looking for IEDs, digging them up, and destroying them. After a while, the frustration was palpable.
We'd come across, you'd hear the ping, and you would just kind of gently start sweeping aside the dirt with your hands. I remember this one time we came across an artillery round. And so we just kind of kept sweeping the dirt around from it, and we would find that it was 2 or 3 artillery rounds. And they were all connected to a man-made or like a homemade pressure plate. I remember thinking as I found these things, some jerk actually took the time to dig this hole and put this thing together and put it in here to kill me. And it became very personal to think about all the work that this person did or people did to go through all that work to kill me and my fellow Marines. And it just made you so mad thinking about the maliciousness,
Eventually, the company commander decided that enough was enough and executed a plan called Operation Steel Curtain, a joint effort with the Army Rangers. The mission's aim was to clear the Al-Qaim region of IED factories by establishing a network of operating bases, clearing houses, and ridding the area of all the bomb makers, or at least of the bomb-making material. The operation wasn't a surprise, though, and the insurgents were waiting. Fortunately, they got their timing wrong.
We must have caught the enemy off guard. They must have expected us to go from east to west. But actually what we did is we went out to Camp Gannon's along the western border, and we went from west to east, kind of throwing them off guard. As we went through from house to house, they had basically rigged entire houses to blow. They would take the artillery rounds and they would stash 2 or 3 in a corner of this room and 2 or 3 in a corner of that room, and just throughout the house. There might be, 10 or 15 artillery rounds hidden throughout this house, kind of in the corners buried under rubble. And they had wired them all to one central detonator, some kind of like a cell phone or something like that, so they could just call it and then blow the whole house up at once, because they knew Marines would typically break down the door, go in and clear the house room to room. And so they knew that they could wait till like a whole squad of Marines got in there and detonate the whole house and kill every Marine in that squad all at once. So as we were going through these houses, we found a lot of those that were rigged up in that way, but they weren't completed. They might have got, 75% of the way done. We did find some, though, that were completed. I remember that we were working closely with some Army EOD guys, and they had one of those signal jammers. And as we were inside this house, and as we were finding all these artillery rounds and finding the detonator and really kind of putting the pieces together, I remember going out to their Humvee to get some of our explosives, because we were going to basically blow up this house. You could see their signal jammer actively working. It was actively blocking that signal as they were trying to detonate it while we were in that house. They were trying to blow up the house on us while we were in it. That activates what we call the pucker effect. It really makes you contemplate your life, because just to know that if that jammer hadn't been working, it would have blown up the whole house and all of us in it. We got all the rounds up, and I think there were a total of like 14 artillery rounds in this house. It was a huge 3-story house inside this city. We worked together with the EOD guys and we blew it up. I can't tell you how many houses we found like that, at least 10. But to see a whole house blow up like that was really impressive. And to know that we were able to catch it before it killed any Marines felt even better.
If he had been on the fence before, the move to squeeze an extra deployment out of him confirmed that Hice was done as a Marine. But like a lot of young people who are single-minded about joining the military, he didn't have a good sense of what life would look like after. He'd become an engineer with an eye on getting into construction after his military career, and while he tried it for a while after coming home, construction just didn't hold much appeal.
Everything that I looked at required a degree of some kind. And so until then, I really hadn't planned on going to college. It was never really on my radar, but I thought, I've got the GI Bill. It can't hurt to try. I started going to a little community college close by. I liked school much better as a 22-year-old than I did as a teenager. The daytime classes had more of your, 18-year-old right out of high school kind of people. It was frustrating because a lot of them didn't really care, and you could tell they didn't care. They were only there because mom and daddy told them they had to be there, and mom and daddy were probably paying for it too. And they were just there because they had to be, much the same way I was in high school. But then also, I did take a lot of night classes too. And in the night classes, you didn't have as much of that. You had a lot more of your working people, people like me who were a little older, who worked during the day and went to school at night. And so that was kind of a different crowd.
Hice's experience is a common one and worth considering for just that reason. After earning his degree, he took leadership positions in his church and community, learning to focus the discipline and endurance he learned in the military as he reintegrated into civilian life. His promise to serve when there wasn't a war on hadn't been affected by the coming of war, just as the commitment to service lasted well past his time as a Marine. Situations may change, but the promise of service is enduring. Next time on This Is War.
This guy turned around and the front of his face was missing. All he had was the bottom part of his jaw. And this guy was so on drugs, he took a knee, reloaded his AK, and took 3 steps before he dropped. And we're like, we thought we were fighting zombies.
Are you a combat veteran, or do you know one with a story to tell? Reach out to us at stories@thisiswar.com with your dates and branch of service and a brief description of the experience that you'd like to share. This Is War was written by me, Anthony Russo, and produced by Incongruity Media. If you like the show, you can help support us by visiting our sponsors or by leaving a 5-star review wherever you're listening right now. You can also follow us on social media at This Is War.